Necro getting bags. Said, God bless. Necro getting bags.
What's up, people? What's up, people?
Sure.
It could impact the president's economic agenda. The president says he has other options and yesterday announced global tariffs of 15%. Joining me now for more is Justin Wolfers, professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. Justin, what do you make of the decision by the Supreme Court to invalidate most of President Trump's tariffs, and how could it shake up the president's economic agenda?
I think it's a good decision. It makes a lot of sense. To be crystal clear, and I think the most important thing to emphasize is nothing the Supreme Court said invalidates tariffs. Nothing says you can't tariff. Nothing prevents the United States from tariffs. All it requires is the president has to convince Congress first. So to the extent that he's got a good idea, I'm sure he can convince the Republican-controlled Congress. To the extent that tariffs are a bad idea, then maybe that Congress, and it looks likely, is going to say no. And so it fundamentally changes the role of tariffs because Congress is involved. The unpopular policies won't be allowed to continue unchecked. The president's initiative was 10%. He changed his mind.
Jihu said, back again NGB.
up to you.
Jihu said. Robot says smash thumbs up suckers.
Just a few hours later, 15% tariffs. Those are tariffs that will run out in 150 days. The president simply doesn't have the power that he hoped he had.
Now, let's talk about that for a second. So the president says he has those other options. Yesterday announced global tariffs of 15%. How would that impact trade deals the U.S. has already signed?
Look, here's the funny secret. We basically don't have any trade deals. Look, I know that there was a lot of reporting that we did have them. And what would happen is the president would throw a tantrum, a world leader would fly in, they'd meet for a while. The world leader, in almost every case, understood that what the president needed was positive headlines. The world leader usually understood that the president breaks agreements as quickly as he makes them. So they made enough concessions that the president would walk out and have a press conference where he'd declare enormous success. But the reality is, and here's the challenge to the viewers at home, you can't find serious signatures on serious agreements. Basically, nothing happened. This was all a reality TV show.
All right, Justin Wolfers, thank you.
President Trump announced he is in. On Friday, the United States Supreme Court ruled that President Trump's policy of imposing sweeping tariffs on the nation's trade partners exceeded his authority as chief executive. Jolene Kent tells us more about the ruling and how it might impact consumers. It's one of the most significant Supreme Court defeats for a U.S. president in modern history. The justices voted 6-3 to strike down a major part of President Trump's economic policy agenda on Friday.
I'm ashamed of certain members of the court.
The court found that the law that gives presidents the power to regulate imports did not authorize President Trump to impose certain tariffs of up to 50% on some countries like Mexico, Canada, and China.
Fox News alert, Prince Andrew had a bad birthday.
President Trump on Air Force One last night, blaming Democrats for the partial government shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security, now entering day 4.
This is a Democrat shutdown. This has nothing to do with the Republicans. This is a Democrat shutdown. They're upset that the crime numbers are so good. They're very unhappy that the crime numbers are so good. They're very unhappy that there's a movement for getting voter ID.
This comes as Democrats send a counter-proposal to the White House and GOP leaders to get operations open again. So far, no deal. The partial shutdown affecting the TSA, Coast Guard, FEMA, and the Secret Service. TSA officials working without pay sparked concerns about staffing shortages and possible travel disruptions, similar to what we saw during last year's record 43-day shutdown. Joining me now is Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman. Senator, it's great to have you this morning. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And I know And I know that the House and Senate are on recess until next Monday. What is the plan do you expect once you're back in session? How long can this shutdown for DHS go on?
I sure hope that we can, but for me, I was the only Democrat that voted to refuse to shutting the government down. And I reminded even the director of ICE in a hearing just on Thursday that this shutdown would not impact the functionality of ICE, that they have plenty of money after the big, beautiful bill. So why shut this down? You can want to reform ICE, and I do, but that's not going to have the impact. But you're willing to shut down all of those very important parts of DHS that you just listed there. That's always wrong. And now here we are, and I'm not sure how we're going to come back online.
Yeah, it's interesting because one wrinkle could be what President Trump says in his State of the Union address, right? I mean, it's unbelievable to me that the last time in 2019 we saw a previous government shutdown and President Trump was forced to delay that State of the Union because of this. The Democrats, some of your colleagues, are threatening that they're not even going to show up for the State of the Union. Will you be there?
Well, I'm saying it's fundamentally wrong to shut our government down. And if you want to reform ICE, as the Democrats, we do want some once, but that is not going to do that. And now why you're doing it, for me, it's always about country over party. And that's why I'll refuse to vote to shut the government down. And now with the the State of the Union, well, and I do expect to attend that, but I do hope there's not the same kinds of thing last year with the paddles and that kinds of disruptions. You can disagree or agree on things, but you don't have to turn it into like a spectacle like that.
I totally agree. And, Senator, that's where I think most people are. You might lean to the right on certain things and lean to the left on other things, but people don't want to see this kind of pettiness, certainly from our elected leaders. Meanwhile, the House passed the SAVE Act, as you know, 218 to 213 in the House. The bill now moves to the Senate. Democrats are vowing to block it with a filibuster. You've been very clear. You have no problem with the voter ID. But Maine Senator Susan Collins reversed her position, and now it looks like the Republicans have 51 votes, and they're talking about this so-called talking filibuster. Sir, and I want to get your take on what this means. The president obviously is urging Senate Majority Leader John Thune to scrap the filibuster altogether and pass the legislation with a simple majority. But it sounds like the Republicans want the Democrats on record to have this quote-unquote talking filibuster so that the public understands who is not for having an ID to vote and who is. I spoke with Senator Bill Hagerty as well as Representative Anna Paulina Luna on this issue over the weekend. Here's what they said. Watch.
The talking filibuster is something that has not been used in a long, long time. It's a complicated process, but I think we're going to look at every way we possibly can to get this to the floor, to defeat the Democrats' obstructionism, and do something that makes common sense for Americans. We've gone through it as a conference, and now that we have Susan on board, I think we're going to be laser focused on this and any other method that we can utilize to get this onto the floor, because this is obviously something the American people want. I think what we'll have, if we actually implement it, is a higher turnout at elections, because people will have more confidence that the election, that their vote is going to be sacred, it's going to be safe, and we're going to have voter integrity.
And I would actually argue that this is probably the number one thing, especially moving into the midterms. Many senators have said, well, if we do this, the Democrats are going to do this when they regain power. But the fact is, Maria, is that the Senate Democrats have made it very clear that they want mass amnesty. They want mass naturalization of illegals. And frankly, I think they're going to do it anyways. And so the only way to really secure our country for future generations is to ensure that Americans have faith in the voting process, and that if their senators work against their interests, that they can vote them out at the ballot box. And that's exactly what this will do.
Senator, you've been very practical on this issue, I know that, but do you think that's what it's about? Your colleagues in the Democrat Party want illegals to vote? Is that why they're so against it?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in this about the SAVE Act. And now, it's not being a serious conversation because right now there's not a Democratic co-sponsor for that. And that's why, because that's necessary because of the filibuster. And that's also part of history to unpack. We, as all the Democrats, we wanted to eliminate the filibuster. We called to eliminate the filibuster. And now we find ourselves that we love it now. And that reminds people that the filibuster is important about bringing on the other parts of to have a conversation. And now for me, there's other parts of SAVE Act that's been problematic for Democrats. But for me, as a Democrat, just fundamentally, at the end of the day, showing basic ID to vote is a very reasonable idea. And I think 84% of Americans in the last polling from Pew supports that. And Wisconsin, a very, very purple state, just less than a year ago, they put that in their constitution, and that was passed nearly by 2 to 1 margin too. Yeah, so that's if it could just come down to where just showing a state ID, any state ID, I think that would make it a more difficult for Democrats to defend just basic kinds of ID.
So what's in there that's beyond there that's so problematic? In other words, if you had a clean bill just showing your ID to vote, you would support that legislation.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm a Democrat that's not going to freak out. The world didn't end what happened in Wisconsin. And in Georgia, for example, which I think skews red, I think we'd agree. And after the law, they elected 2 Democrat senators too. So for me, that's kind of where we're at. So there's a lot to impact on that.
Understood. The president has floated doing an executive order to get the SAVE Act across the line. Is that possible, Senator? Or, because I mean, you're the only Democrat in the Senate who said, yes, you understand voter ID and you're comfortable with it. Is there any way that, do you see anybody else in your party that in the Senate that you think could support that along with yourself?
I don't know. I can't speak for anyone, but what I can say, what I've seen, if it's just a state ID and states provide free ones, I think everybody should have ID, honestly. That allows people to have more chance to participate in our society, whether joining through a library or renting a car or doing all kinds of things. What that excludes for a lot of Americans is they don't have just a basic state ID.
Yeah.
So, and the vast majority of Americans have no problem with that. And then there's kinds of examples, whether it's Wisconsin or Georgia, that hasn't really seemed to be like the end of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to move on and talk about Iran. Your voice has been so important here in terms of support for Israel. And of course, the president just met with Netanyahu again. U.S. and Iran officials held another round of nuclear talks in Geneva today. I believe the talks at this point have ended this morning as military tensions continue to rise between the two nations. Iranian naval forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, conducted military drills in the Strait of Hormuz Monday, and Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are leading these negotiations. I want to get your take on this because in the middle of all of these talks, Senator, it looks like Khomeini is mocking the United States again. First, here's the president on his role in all of this. Watch.
Probably involved in those talks indirectly, and they'll be very important. We'll see what can happen. It's been typically Iran's a very tough negotiator. They're good negotiators or bad negotiators. I would say they're bad negotiators because we could have had a deal instead of sending the B-2s in to knock out their nuclear potential. And we had to send the B-2s. I hope they're going to be more reasonable. I think they want to make a deal. I don't think they want the consequences of not making a deal.
Senator, if this group can't even, sort of hold back on their hostilities against the United States during the talks, what should we expect? Because here are Khomeini's tweets. The U.S. president has said that for 47 years, the United States has not been able to eliminate the Islamic Republic. That's a good confession, I say. You, too, will not be able to do this. Then he goes on to say, the Americans constantly say that they've sent a warship toward Iran. A warship is a dangerous piece of military hardware. However, more dangerous than that warship is the weapon that can send that warship to the bottom of the sea. So now they're threatening us on their nuclear capabilities, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's laughable. I mean, I think it took Israel like exactly about 2 days to achieve new air supremacy, and they were begging for a ceasefire about that war last year. And now, absolutely, I supported the B-2s bombing their nuclear facilities well too. We can never allow Iran to acquire a nuclear bomb. Absolutely not. And I was the only Democrat to support striking those facilities, and it will be probably the only Democrat again. Now, that's why it's entirely important to make sure that Iran never acquires that nuclear bomb. So I don't think you can trust Iran right now, and they are so desperate now. They were executing thousands and thousands of their young citizens just wanting for rights and democracy too. So I think they're teetering, and I think they're scared, and that's why they put out that laughable tweet just recently, because they know that they're scared and they realize that we mean business, and now we can strike and hit their nuclear facilities again because we have the ability to do exactly that.
Well, I mean, it's literally a threat. I mean, the other tweet from Khomeini says the U.S. president keeps saying that they have the strongest military force in the world. The strongest military force in the world may at times be struck so hard that it cannot get up again.
Yeah, I mean, it's laughable.
Yeah.
I mean, Israel just absolutely wrecked them into submission just last year. And now here we are now. It's like they do not have the capabilities to talk that tough. They can't back it up. And now I hope that there's a peaceful kinds of outcome, but I don't think that's going to happen because the only thing that they respect and respond to is force, just exactly what we used about destroying parts of their nuclear facilities. And I'll be the Democrat to stand with Israel through that, for peace in the region. And now let's call Iran what they are, and they need to be taken out of the business of acquiring a nuclear bomb.
So the president has put sanctions and tried to use diplomacy in this situation since that, taking out the nuclear facilities. But now the president wants the ballistic missiles taken out, and he wants the Iranians to stop supporting these terrorist proxies. You say, look, the world knows Iran's never going to honor any of this and any treaty. So why are we negotiating? What are we negotiating?
I agree. I've said that on Twitter just a couple of days ago. It's like, why? I mean, to me, it's a waste of time. They only respond by force and strength, and I fully support that. And another thing we want to remind people, if China didn't buy the vast majority of all their oil, that absolutely would have broken that regime. China is willing to support this regime, and they continue to provide the revenue that backs up their regime. So here we are. We can't ever allow these kinds of nuclear ambitions and now all these other missiles technology too. I will support those kind of strikes, and if we do bring up another Iranian war powers, I will vote no against that too.
Well, you raise a really important point in terms of China, because China acts like a friend to the United States, but then is complicit on every level, undermining the United States. What do you want to see out of this upcoming meeting between the president and Xi Jinping in April? Because I know that there are plenty of Chinese companies that trade on our exchanges. And, I mean, aren't we in many ways just funding the expansion of our number one adversary here? Are there other things to be doing to get in touch with China so that they're not bullying the world like they are right now with their critical minerals?
Absolutely. I mean, they're not, obviously they're not an ally. They're not even, I'm not sure they're even a frenemy. So for me, confront them. Why do you buy all of the Iranian oil, and that props up a poisonous regime and a destabilizing force in the region? Why don't you want peace in the Middle East? Why would you want to support that? Because they back the kinds of proxies that, the Hamas and Hezbollah. Why? So So I think that's entirely appropriate if the president confronts them and demands that they must stop this kind of destabilizing force. And it's actually evil standing with a regime like Iran.
Yeah, and you've tweeted about a lot of this as well, and I want to get your take on sort of the response that you get from your colleagues, because you look at all of these issues in such a practical way, which is why you've got so many fans and so many supporters of moderates and Republicans as well. Senator, you've said to me in the past that there's rot within the Democrat Party when it comes to anti-Israel rhetoric among some members. I mean, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently suggested that the U.S. should consider reevaluating military aid to Israel. I mean, it was stunning. Tell us more.
No, I agree. You know, I've consistently, that's part of the rot in the Democratic Party. You know, why, if you have to pick a side, why would you pick the side or defend Hamas or defend Iran in a way? For me, stand with Israel. I'll never vote for any kinds of restrictions on aid, whether it's military, financial, or intelligence. There are ever going to be any restrictions on that. And now for here we are, we can have peace. Again, that's become part of the serious problem in our party.
So are the Democrats standing in the way, extremists like AOC, are they standing in the way of peace in the Middle East then?
Well, I'm saying I refuse to pander to the part of my Democratic Party that finds that there's value in being anti-Israel. And that's effectively, they use the word anti-Zionism. I mean, effectively, what that's really become on college campuses and places is just anti-Semitism. You know, we have a problem here in our party, and I'm going to stand against that and always unapologetic supporter for Israel.
And I think all of this will be in the President's State of the Union address coming up in 1 week's time. And of course, then we're all in on what.
Yeah.
my mount. It's not good. I'll be back later if I'm getting a phone mount again. It's not, yeah, fucked up my phone mount. So later. Can't keep my phone in. Yeah.
Look at that bird in front of